Alright, response video Mara Mystic again. Might as well do this because some of these points are important, but I couldn't even watch the whole video. So, yeah, I cut off the little
And all
introduction
this,
bullshit.
do we pay our taxes to be used by the government sort of stuff. I'll just fire off a comment that I've just got. I was about to answer on the.
Right, used by the government to do what? Right, that's right. Hire people to inspect food and to do the police officer thing and to do the school teacher thing and to do the mailman thing. And yeah, I don't see the government building a bunch of Lear jets. So except for the government expenditures that go to the military industrial complex or even NASA that goes to a bunch of private corporations like Boeing and all the rest of those, and they just rip us off completely for this technology. Yeah, beyond the stuff that's paid to all these private contractors, how exactly are the government expenditures all that outrageous? The salaries aren't that high. So people have to show up and go to work. So is it really that awful? No, I don't think so.
Website. Um, all the same, this has extremely far-reaching consequences, and I think it does, and I might go into that later. The fact that our taxes are basically thrown in the trash, and I hope to touch on that, and if this is indeed how it is, then what could be the reasons for the taxation, as perhaps these reasons, and then lists reasons.
Yeah, right. The taxes are thrown in the trash, right? So they pay for the Medicare stuff, they pay for the Social Security stuff. Again, they pay for the highways, all kinds of infrastructure, fixing bridges, all kinds of stuff like that. And we're just going to call that throwing the money away. Yeah, right. Sure. But when some rich guy spends it on marble floors and yachts that only 3 people in the world would ever be on, that expenditure is perfectly great. The human race is so much better off that it has those yachts filling up the harbor.
Nice, and I've got. This is why I had to go to this video because I could have I've answered in comments in Tippy Tappy, but it's a lot easier for me to sit here and just splurge it out on the video. It isn't as though it's a newly developed master plan that's put in place for some reason. It's just an accident of history, basically. That's all we're dealing with. These buildings that I talked about yesterday, buildings 1, 2, and 3.
All right. Well, he's talking about the idea of doing commerce. Okay, that we sort of fell into it. We did it like we did the internet. It sort of started off sloppy. You figure out mechanisms that work. So yeah, we figured we did the barter thing. You just traded a sheep for a camel. You had to do all your trading pretty directly right in front of each other so you could make sure you weren't getting cheated. And then we came up with instruments and capacities to do commerce in different ways. And he's going to say gold came first, and I'm going to say contracts came first. But it doesn't really matter which one came first. The point is there are two kinds of commerce. We can still do commerce with things of value that you can hold in your hand. There just aren't a whole lot of things that have value you can hold in your hand. And the rest of the commerce is basically trading contracts. And the great advantage of contracts is that somebody can't just kill you and steal the contract. But then when you make money, paper money, it's sort of in between the two. It's a hard currency. Anybody can own it. Okay, it doesn't. It's possession is 99% of the law kind of thing. So it has its advantages and disadvantages. But all it is a contract. That's all a dollar bill is. It's a contract. It says you're entitled to this much value.
They're there. We all know they're there, and they are there for a good reason, because they were there for a good reason. And we have to go back to the gold standard, and when men were men and little furry animals from Alpha Centauri were little furry animals from Alpha Centauri.
Whatever this means. Again, the gold standard is a canard, okay? The gold standard, if you could have a gold standard now, and how would anything change? Okay, you'd have $5 trillion in the bank, okay, in gold, to cover the amount of cash that's in circulation, because there's only $5 trillion worth. All right, and that would be your gold standard. It wouldn't change the fact that you could still print bonds. Okay, so a gold standard wouldn't stop you from printing a bond, so you could still borrow the money. And that's what causes the fucking inflation, is the borrowed money. It has it to be paid. Somebody has to work in the future to pay it back. It requires the extra labor to be produced to pay it back. It's borrowed fucking labor.
In the gold standard, we kind of understood what was going on, for one thing, and everyone understood vaguely what was going on. I mean, it was always fudged, but
Yeah, and it's just sort of a canard, okay? Because banks originally were developed not to be a place where you get interest. It was a place that had a vault so you could protect your assets. It was a repository. It was a safe deposit box. That's what a bank was. It was a place you put your stuff so somebody couldn't steal it.
we had a vague handle that we understood what was what, and we could understand that money was nuggets of gold. Let's call them nuggets of gold, and we knew that if we worked for a good week, we would get a certain amount of nuggets of gold, and the time came on where we understood that it was a bit silly walking around with nuggets of gold. We might as well have paper which represented the nuggets of gold, and if we lost faith in the paper, we could always go to the bank and get out the nuggets of gold.
Yeah, well, look, the point was is that the currency shouldn't have any real value because that's just being wasteful. Because yeah, money can be lost, a lot of things can happen, and so why have money that's as expensive as its value? Why have something that's just a contract? Why would you make a contract? You wouldn't make a contract out of gold. You wouldn't make a deed to a house out of solid gold. Like if you had a $400,000 house, you wouldn't make the deed for the house out of $400,000 worth of gold. That would be preposterously ludicrous. So it's a lot more functional to have contract exchange currency that isn't made out of something more valuable than its face value.
So it was just more convenient to use the paper, but we mentally thought in nuggets of gold because that's what the standard was. That's what money was, nuggets of gold. That's what work represented, nuggets of gold. They were real things. And in a way,
But gold isn't even a real thing. So this is all part of the canard too. I mean, gold was what kind of economy did that produce? It produced economies that inflated and deflated to irrational extremes. Okay, it created things like where people would go across the country to go dig money out of the ground, completely unproductive labor, because you valued some stupid material. So you're much better off having something people can't dig out of the ground and calling it value, because it just creates a lot of waste.
eh, although were taxes ever paid in nuggets of gold? I don't know anyway. But when
And if they were, what would they end up getting paid in? Is yeah, nuggets of gold that somebody had bitten the corners off of. You know, somebody had shaved down and stolen the gold value out of. So there was so much fraud and forgery and crap that went on when you had a gold standard currency.
the taxes went to building one, that was real. That was a real representation of the ability to withdraw nuggets of gold, or what they would have always thought about it would have been. That was real gold going into building one, and then real gold would be transferred to building two. And
This is just part of the canard. This is just if you're going to create a new currency tomorrow, how would you distribute it? How would you create it? Well, you would require somebody to bring some kind of real value into the bank, like a house deed, and then you would give him currency in exchange for the house deed. So all the money would still be collateralized. All the money that has been printed has been collateralized. Every single piece, every dollar has a trail. And at the end of that trail is a deed or a commodity or some other thing that has value appreciable to what that currency was provided in exchange for.
real gold would be spent out of building two back into the economy. And everybody could understand that.
Yeah, but what no one can understand is that you can't make money if you're a bank if you keep the money in a vault. All right? You can't make money that way. The money does not grow in a vault. It does not double, it does not triple, it does nothing. If I put wheat in a silo, it doesn't multiply on its own. I have to feed it to people and make them work, and then maybe I can get a silo and a half back. But I can't do that unless I convert the wheat into something. The wheat on itself will not grow. Gold in a vault will not do anything productive.
But that was over 100 years ago. Well, I'm not going to argue too much about the exact details of the gold standard. I mean, we know that we've had strong gold standards, weak gold standards. medium gold standards during World.
Look, just understand what they mean by a gold standard. Again, all they're saying is that the federal government would have in the bank, in a vault, wasting space, just taking up space, trillions of dollars of an asset to account for every dollar it printed. So it would basically disable that money, cripple it, take it out of the economy. That's the consequence of a gold standard. It does nothing productive. It's completely destructive. And it makes interest rates preposterously higher because it makes less value, less money available for lending. So obviously you're going to have to pay more. If there's $5 trillion that can't be lent, okay, then there's obviously less lendable currency in the less lendable asset in the economy. That means you're going to have to pay a higher premium to borrow money. So, I mean, it doesn't do you any good. It's not a good thing to keep gold in a vault.
Wars, you come off your gold standard, then you go back on your gold standard, and after the Second World War, you renegotiate treaties where you have wishy-washy gold standards. And
yeah, well, look, the point is that you had to finance your wars. So part of the financing was issuing bonds that we still haven't paid back, and part of the financing was printing some cash without a gold equivalent. So yes, that's what they did. In desperate times, they basically were creating a potential for inflation by printing cash without taking in any asset. So they were diluting the value of the cash so that in the short term, they could have more spending power so they could recover from a catastrophe. And the problem, there's no real problem with doing that except that they never paid the money back. And that's the problem. If you never pay back the loan, then you're going to pay interest on that loan forever.
Basically what happened after the Second World War is all tapered away up till, was it 1970 or 71, where Nixon finally closed the gold window and all connection with bits of paper and nuggets of gold was completely and utterly finished. Okay. And I'm going to go...
And again, he's defending archaic, stupid, ignorant, useless bank practice. I mean, even 400 years ago, when they actually did have that kind of currency, the bankers all cheated on it. Okay, they all printed IOU pieces of paper, okay, that were promises for gold they didn't have in the bank. And they did it because they could afford to, because all they needed was a certain reserve to cover any kind of run on the bank. So as long as they were covered for any kind of realistically possible run, they could lend out more currency. And that was very productive. It wasn't destructive, it was productive. And it only becomes destructive when you never reaccount for the money, when you never take it back in again and pay the bills back.
Ask the time in 1970 where you would imagine you were sending bits of paper up into building number 1, and they would pass bits of paper into building number 2, and they would...
Again, just explain how a gold standard would have stopped us from printing bonds. And explain how the bonds aren't the problem. The printing of bonds that you never pay back, that you pay perpetual interest on. Explain how that isn't the problem. That $15 trillion in currency, essentially, how that hasn't diluted the value of the money.
Spend bits of paper into building number 3. What we've got now is so weird that it is incomprehensible, is that we now work our good weekly work for points of light, basically. That is about it, isn't it? I mean, we know that some people work for bits of paper, but most of us have worked most of our life for points of light. And then we go to the stores and we buy things in points of light.
Oh, what? I mean, this reductionism. So somehow you're saying that somehow there's a fraud in the system. Okay, that the bank regulators aren't doing their job and somebody's just stealing zillions and zillions. Well, of course, there are some people stealing lots of money, maybe billions of dollars, through manipulations of the stock market, manipulations of the bond market, and taking complete advantage, okay, because of government connections and all of that stuff. But this is a small percentage of the economy, the theft. And you know that realistically, you're not just getting a point of light. You're getting a piece of value. There's a paper trail to all those points of light, and you goddamn know it.
I mean, that's effectively what we do, isn't it? So We pay our taxes in points of light. They go up to building one. What do you expect building one to do? To put them in a points of light box, put them in the back of the van and take them over to building two. So building two can spend your old points of light back into the economy. Of course not. No, they're registered in on a computer disk, probably, definitely, as points of light, and building two just starts again with new points of light, and the points of light go in for bits of paper into building three, and that is what we've got. And I think the struggle to understand that is because it's not comprehensible. We can't.
Oh, look, the underlying system is comprehensible. There's a certain number of people in the world doing labor. They're creating value. And then all we're doing is through these points of light distributing the ownership of that value. And the ownership will be dictated by whether you get a piece of contract cash. Cash is a deed. It's a promissory note. Or you get a bond, or you get a stock portfolio, or whatever percentage you're getting. Okay, but it's just parsed out. And the problem with our economy is that there's more claims to ownership than there are real assets. And so the only other asset there is to claim ownership of is future labor. And so there's a bunch of people with IOUs for 20 or 30 years of labor into the future. And they're going to expect to get paid that labor. And there's just no people to do the labor. The people can't work two jobs. They have to work one job just to feed themselves, and they don't have the capacity to work a second job to pay back that IOU.
I don't understand that we work for a week for points of light. We pay in points of light, and things are exchanged in points of light. It's the scorecard. It's just points of light on a scoreboard.
But the point is, it's a scoreboard. It represents a real interaction. So again, you're talking. You're trying to create the illusion that it's an illusion. It's not an illusion. The money has trails.
And that's what all anything is now, and why we can't understand it, and why we think, well, this is ludicrous and impossible and madness, and so we can't get a concept in our heads so we can conceptualize it and think about it.
I don't know why you keep saying we, because I'm not. It's getting clearer and clearer to me. There's people creating value, and there's people consuming the value. It's not that complicated.
Go back to pre-1970 days, Second World War, pre-First World War, back to 100 years ago. So we think 100 years old thinking of our taxes being nuggets of gold that we've actually earned, going up to building one, them shipping them to building two, and going around. It just is not the way it's done anymore. The accounting is the accounting in building one.
Well, whatever. You really can't do this building 1, 2, 3 thing, because it's just not. It's a metaphor. Now you're metaphoring about your metaphor. I mean, you got too many layers of metaphor. You really have to start talking about something explicit. Okay, there's cash put into the economy through the banking system. The cash is monetized and collateralized before it's produced. There's a bond market where money is borrowed on future, so it has to be paid. An interest has to be paid, and so there's some sort of extra value has to be extracted from somewhere to pay that interest and the principal eventually. That's just the reality of the circumstance. So as soon as you print a bond, you've created an IOU. All right, and the IOU has to be paid in the future.
And spending of money is just, even writing it on bits of paper is just represented. The bits of paper are representatives of points of light. I mean, there's nothing there. There is.
Oh, again, this is just nonsense. What there is a claim of ownership, and we clearly understand that 10% of the population claims to own 80% of the economy. And that's the circumstance we exist in. All right? We can say I own my life, but in truth I don't own my life because I owe the federal government $200,000 and I can't pay it.
Absolutely nothing there. So in a way it's not surprising that the whole thing is utterly ludicrous and incomprehensible, is because it is madness. It is total madness, and there are laws in place. that that building 3 has to sell a certain amount of bits of paper, 4 points of light, to make the accounting correct in building 1.
Well, again, I mean, it's just making this more complicated than it has to be. There's two entities borrowing money. There's private citizens, well, there's three: private citizens, businesses, and governments. Those three entities are making contracts every day, okay, where they say, you give me the money today, I'll pay you back tomorrow. All right, and with every one of those contracts now becomes a piece of currency. Okay, so it's part of the currency that's in circulation, because those are all legitimate deeds, all demonetized in dollar amounts, so they all have recognized and authoritative value, those contracts, so they essentially become currency. And so now we have, instead of just $5 trillion worth of cash, we have trillions of dollars worth of government bonds, trillions of dollars, billions of dollars anyway, of business loans and personal debt loans. And all those contracts are all claiming to own that $5 trillion worth of cash. They're all claims on whatever that cash has been collateralized by. And that's where the jig is up, because the cash can't cover all of that debt. There's too many IOUs and too few deeds. There's not enough car deeds and house deeds and cash. Yes, you have to include the deeds. So you include the deeds and the cash in the economy, and then try to balance that against, the deeds to an actual asset, not a deed to a stock, which is, who knows what the value of the real business is. In a failing economy, all that stock stuff could be completely illusionary. But yeah, that's the real game. There's IOUs and there's assets. There's more IOUs than there are assets. That's failure.
But that is just because it's an old law that predates 1970 and probably even goes back over 100 years. But that's the only reason they're doing it, is because nobody's bothered to repeal that law. It's not needed anymore because nobody bothers with anything. Points of light are very, very easy to get hold of. And that is the bottom line.
Well, it isn't. Like I said, all those points of light have a paper trail. I'm not saying it's regulated enough, but I'm just saying it is regulated. There is a paper trail, a point of light trail, whatever you want to call it. Okay, there are deeds and there are IOU contracts. They exist. These contracts all exist.
And the bottom line is more points of light. And I'm sorry if this doesn't explain things, but hopefully it just explains how this madness has come about. It's just an accident of history. And in history,
Well, it's the same accident we keep crashing into, though. It's this stupid consolidation of wealth, okay? We're at the same point we were in 1928, okay? We've done the Roaring 20 thing. We did the Roaring 90s thing. Everybody's got a 47-inch television and a $40,000 car. Yeah, and so we played the game, and now the game is going to blow up again. Not that complicated.
could understand the solidity of swapping nuggets of gold about, but that was 100 years ago. And ever since then, it's just slippery sloped all the way down to what we've got now, which is basically thousands of points of light.
Again, a gold standard would have done nothing. It wouldn't have prevented people from borrowing money. Okay, unless you're saying the banks couldn't lend any money but gold. So if that's your argument, then we know interest rates would have been preposterously high, and there would have been almost, the whole economy would have been many times smaller, because there would have been no way to take that investment capital and convert it into real labor or work or investment, because nobody could afford to have a new idea, because no one could afford to borrow any money, because interest rates would be so high. So that's the fault of your system. Your system of keeping the gold in the bank is not would not have done anybody any good.
I'll leave it there. So I've got to carry on because I can't leave it there. Okay, so the madness here is now. Hopefully when you hear this, you'll realise how stupid this is. Okay, which way should I attack this? Okay, but I'll just repeat again. So you send your points of light, your taxes, to Building 1. People buy treasury bills with points of light into Building 3. And the government spends with points of light out of Building 2. Now, okay, we've got that. So the president, okay, does one of his addresses to the people and says, we are spending beyond our means, and we are going to have to cut back on expenditure. The deficit will be halved.
Okay, why don't you mock Ronald Reagan? Okay, Ronald Reagan said to the people, I got this voodoo bullshit, okay, because my head is way up the rich man's ass, so here's my voodoo policy for America. Let's talk about cutting government, but never do it. Let's grow the government instead. Let's expand the military let's double it. So let's spend a preposterous amount of money and cut the taxes, because we don't really need the revenues. Because, see, if we cut the revenues will grow. Okay, that's how it works. That's my theory. That if I cut the revenues coming into the government, that more revenues will come in the next year. And the more I cut the revenues that come in, the more revenues will somehow come in the next year. And I'll just keep promising that somehow in the future you're going to get even more money somehow, even though you have less money. Yeah, so why don't you mock Ronald Reagan? Oh, that's right, because you're never going to account for the fact that the problem that precipitated this entire nonsense was the cutting of taxes. Not the need to raise them now, but the fact that we should have never cut them in the first place. That was the creation of the deficit. The deficit was a minor problem at the end of Jimmy Carter's term. It became a huge problem at the end of Ronald Reagan's term.
With blah blah blah. What he's talking about is amounts of points of light. All right, that is all he is talking about. We cannot hand over to the next generation deficits such as what he's talking about is our points of light. Right. What he's saying is we cannot ask our children and our grandchildren to earn all these points of light when we're not prepared to. I mean, that is what is being said. It is.
Yeah, it's being said, and absolutely no policy is put in place to do a damn thing about it.
Ludicrous nonsense to think that the United States of America is constrained in its ability to create points of light. It just beggars belief. Now,
again, so now he's somehow making an argument that it doesn't matter how much money the government borrows, that somehow that's not a huge future liability that will crush the entire capacity of the government to function, especially when inflation actually takes hold. Commodity inflation is already taking place, all right? Once fuel prices triple and food prices triple, all of a sudden that deficit is going to be preposterously huge, the interest on that debt, and you won't have any money left over to do anything but just pay back the interest.
Now, I am more than vaguely convinced. I'm absolutely convinced they have got not a clue what they're talking about. Because they cannot conceptualize points of light and realize that that is all that they're talking about, they talk.
Oh, whatever. I mean, this is just kind of silly. Look, I mean, I hate the politicians, but I think they all knew the game we were playing, okay? I don't think it was a grand mystery. There was people 30 years ago who were ranting and raving about deficit spending and how you got to account for it. You can't just keep doing it, okay? You can't keep claiming you have a crisis and never pay the money back.
Or think and conceptualize in 100-year-old sorts of terminology and conceptions of chunks of gold, that it just does not pertain anymore. So when the President of the United States says that we can't ask our children to create these points of light, it's just nonsense. And the reason I mention this is because
sorry, this is just so incoherent. I mean, points of light, why don't you there's no way to discuss the economy. I mean, it sounds like Ronald Reagan's 1,000 points of light that was in his speech. I mean, this is just rhetoric. This just isn't going to work.
Actually, now could change the way this crazy political system goes on at the moment, which is childish nonsense. It really is so stupid. And maybe it's because it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what money is.
And well, maybe you should name a name. What do you think? Ron Paul's got the right idea? Who are you claiming understands the economy enough to do what needs to be done? Because I'm not hearing anybody talking what the real problem is that there's a few people who have a ton of IOUs in their pocket, and maybe we should be taxing them to get some of those IOUs back. Okay, but until we do that, if we keep taxing, what we're doing now is we're moving the tax base from the rich to the poor. And what we're basically doing is we're taxing welfare recipients in subtle, indirect ways by taxing their cigarettes, or we'll tax their lottery. We'll create a lottery, and they'll waste some of their welfare money on the lottery, and they'll waste money on these different things that we'll tax. We'll tax their gambling and their other vices. And so that's completely unproductive. You've got to concede. I mean, that's just, why tax a benefit that you're giving people? Because you're just going to have to increase the benefit because they won't be able to function on the benefit you've given them. So that doesn't go anywhere. You have to tax the people that actually possess the IOUs. No point in taxing the people who don't own any IOUs.
That it is also stupid. Maybe we can't conceptualize it, but we know in the back of our mind or in our gut that there is something completely wrong, or there's something just crazy going on, and we can't get into this politics thing because it just doesn't seem right.
Yeah, well, like I said, the bottom line is we have paid people who own more than we pay people who work. Okay, and you just can't. That's unsustainable into the future. You can't pay the owners more than the workers and have any hope of going in any kind of positive direction, because all that's going to mean is that the rich will keep getting richer and workers will keep getting poorer, and there'll be less and less incentive to work, and you create what we have been through before. You just go back to some sort of noble system, some sort of the rich owning the world bullshit. And then you have to do the pitchfork revolution thing all over again.
Maybe that is what is going on. So it might be what I answered a couple of times yesterday and was starting to develop a very interesting possibility if it could be admitted by the US president. He just stands there and says, this talk about deficits and having to pass on deficits and to our children is complete nonsense. We are the United States. We can create as many points of light as we want. Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. I don't even know where you're going with this. Because they've gotten away with it in the past, you're saying they'll get away with it forever. Like, this isn't somehow putting a ton of inflation behind a dam, and eventually the dam is going to break. And depending on how much water you have behind that dam, is going to decide how much damage it's going to do. And you're just saying, just pile more and more water on the other side of that dam, and we'll worry about it when the dam breaks. Well, I think that's just nonsense. You can't keep doing it. It is going to break, and how much damage it's going to do is going to be dependent on how much crap you have put on the other side of that fucking dam.
There's no constraint on the American government creating points of light. Can we agree on that? Okay, it can create.
Yeah, it can create it, but not at no cost. Again, you keep talking like because the inflation doesn't happen today, that the inflation will not happen. No, it is inflation, and it will be released. And when it's released, there won't be any incentive to work anymore. There won't be any government revenues anymore. There won't be anything anymore.
With many points of light, as it bloody well wants. Right. There are some old hangover problems, like the law that it's got to create these points of light to buy treasury bills.
And again, you're just ignoring the argument that if 10% of the population own 90% of the points of light, those are basically, the points of light are incentive carrots. So if you have all the incentive carrots in the pockets of people who aren't doing any work, that's like shoving the carrots up the horse's ass. It will do you no fucking good. You will get no value out of a carrot if you are shoving it up a horse's ass.
But they can all be done away with, and you could get into the 21st century and deal with what is actually the reality of the world, which are these stupid points of light. They're just points. It's point scoring. It's points of light. That is all that's going on.
Again, they're claims of ownership. We've been over this. I mean, I wish you would just accept some rational rhetoric here. Claims of ownership. That's what all these things are. They're claims of ownership.
So, repeat. to say that the United States government is constrained in its ability to create points of light is stupid. Okay, so if that could be told to the people, and the people are told that their taxes really count for absolutely nothing because they are only points of light going into a building where they're going to be just registered, and that is it. And then the government restarts with new points of light out of building 2.
So now he's just basically talking flat tax. So now he's basically saying, just don't bother taxing anybody, just print the money, okay? And so don't take any revenues in, just create inflation for everybody. But that's not going to work when 10% of the people have 90% of the value, okay? Because then all you're going to do is crush the people that have the 10% that's left over. So if there was some way to do this flat tax thing where you just didn't crush the lower classes and completely make it, you have to, they are the ones that need more incentive, not less incentive. And a flat tax creates less incentive because a flat tax will destroy their capacity to even sustain their existence. That's the end result. They have to be, their existence has to be subsidized. And your theory of destroying the value of all the money doesn't fix that problem.
The people actually knew that the taxes, or that their taxes, their ability to spend on things at the cinema, at Walmart, on holidays, buying a new car, were being taken away from them, because that's what points of light do represent, buying power. They're being taken away from them. And they realised that for a greater extent, it's being taken away from them for absolutely no reason at all.
You know, why don't you deal with the real equation, though? The real equation over the last 50 years is that the 10% have acquired more and more and more, a higher percentage of the claims of ownership. The working classes have lost claims of ownership in terms of percentage and value weight of the whole pie. They're getting less and less and less of the pie. And that's the real problem in the economy, is we're paying people not to work, and we're not paying people who work enough.
I think that they would get very quickly into a mature adult discussion with the government about exactly what they're doing with their taxes, which does not exist now. All we've got,
again, you're griping about how the government spends the money, okay? You don't provide any examples of the waste, and you'll never discuss how the government collects the money it expends. And that's the important thing. How is the collection weighted? Do we collect the money back for the expense of bankruptcy by taxing inheritance? Well, why don't we do that? I mean, if we have a system in place that allows people to take a risk, collect all the profits of the risk, inherit the profits of the risk, but never have to pay for the risk, then that's bullshit. That's a nonsensical system. So if you're going to allow people to inherit unlimited wealth, then you should allow people to inherit unlimited debt. So if your father steals money, breaks the law, owes money, then you as his son should be able to inherit his liability. Because if you're going to allow somebody to inherit the profit, you have to allow people to inherit the risk. And if you're going to say they shouldn't be obliged to pay that risk, which I would argue, yes, that would be quite insane to do that, well, then you simply tax the inheritees to pay for the risk. Okay, so that would be the first rational tax you have. It's a rational tax on inheritance.
now is kind of, I pay my taxes, and so I expect this, and this. And that doesn't get anywhere because it isn't based on any sort of fact. It's just nonsense. So if it could be admitted that the taxes are being taken away for no reason at all, then those people in Washington would actually have to ask people, what is going on with all these taxes? Why are we taking them away from the people? What is the actual constraint on us spending vastly more points of light?
Yeah, well, I'm just saying that the constraint has to be a willful one. You can't stop the borrowing with some sort of artificial mechanism, because that artificial mechanism can be defeated with another artificial mechanism. So again, a gold standard does not stop the U.S. government from printing bonds. And you're not going to be able to write into a law that it will. I mean, you're not going to pass a constitutional amendment in the United States of America that says the federal government is not allowed to issue bonds. I just don't think there's any chance in hell you're going to pass that. I would be for it, but you're not going to pass it.
What are the actual problems with it. What might happen down the road if we spend a lot more or spend a lot less, or don't take as many points of light as taxes from the people, or don't get the people to spend points of light buying treasury bits of paper.
Yeah, again, they aren't treasury bits of paper. They're promises on future labor. So, again, you can say that they haven't paid the tax, but in a sense they have paid it. They just have to do the actual work in the future.
Which they get then interest, which is more bits of points of light on. Just to ask, sit down around the table and say, what the bloody hell is going on here? And then, if they think it's got worked it out,
The rich are getting richer, and workers are getting less and less, provided less and less incentive to work. That's what's going on here. We're paying people to own. We're not paying people to work.
the people would be panting for an explanation of quite what's going on here. And I think that as soon as the people knew that their taxes were going to building one for absolutely no reason at all, just because it was a historical hangover from a system that existed effectively 100 years.
Again, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, he's basically arguing that we should just borrow all the money or deflate the currency. So we either destroy your currency with 20% inflation every year, or we borrow the money, which means we pay interest on it forever. So those two sound like lousy and irresponsible reactions. My argument would be that you have to pay your taxes. Okay, you have to pay. The government has to take in. It has to take in enough to cover what it goes out, and that's just the way it is. It has to maintain a rational budget.
Years ago, and it has just petered out 40 years ago completely. I think that they would get really involved in the political economic system, and then the entire populations of countries would be there thinking.
Well, whatever. All this crap isn't going to happen because we're not, if we were in a system where we're saying, okay, we're going to start the game now. Okay, the game starts now. Well, then we'd have a conversation about the rules of the game and how the game's going to be played. But that's not what we're doing. We're saying we're taking a system that's 70 years old or 80 years old. Liabilities, they're 80 years old. Somebody made a contract 80 years ago, and I'm going to be expected to honor it. Okay, that's the game we're in here now. Okay, there's a bunch of deals that have been made that say I owe this and I got to do this and I got to do that, and I didn't agree to any of that crap. And so nobody's going to have a rational conversation from this starting point. I'm not going to start playing a game where the rules are I start off in debt for $200,000. I'm not going to play that game. No, I'd rather go to Las Vegas than play a game where I start off $200,000 in debt.
Working out what to do with the points of light.
And again, to debt to a bunch of loafing motherfuckers who don't do any work and are just saying, I'm an elitist motherfucker, I inherited ownership, you must work for me. That's not going to work. I'm not going to work for some fucker who hasn't done any work himself. Fuck that.
Everybody would be very involved in what to do with the points of light, as opposed to now where it seems that nobody is in the slightest bit bothered. So I think it'd be a very good thing to have out in the open.
Well, again, like I said, there's no point in having it out in the open if your premise is we have to accept the old contracts. We have to play by the old rules. So unless you're saying let's do a reboot and now let's talk about how the system should be, well, then it's game on. But I'm not going to talk about how I should do a few $100,000 worth of work for some bitch in Long Island who says I own IBM stock and you owe me $200,000. Fuck that.
So people would get involved, and then the combined brains of the people would maybe come up with the best things to do with these points of light.
Yeah, well, like I said, we know the best thing to do is just to say the hell with the points of light. Let's just wipe the slate clean in some sort of ordered, rational mechanism where we make people pay a little bit of a penalty for having debt, we give people a little bit of credit for not having debt, and we just reapportion ownership of all this nonsense. We just change who possesses the IOUs and how many they can possess. and then we start the game anew. And then we make new rules that say, okay, we're not going to let anybody get into this preposterous borrowing bullshit again. Okay, there's got to be limits. We're not going to borrow 30 years in ahead. We're not going to borrow on your grandchildren's labor. You can't make those kind of contracts. You either make a rational contract that gets paid in a specific amount of time, or you don't make a contract.
And now I have finally finished. Thanks, bye.
And you certainly don't pay
Morning,
people
son.
not to work. You don't pay people for falling out of the preferential vaginas. You have a fair game, a fair race. You don't tie people's legs together. You don't give people head starts. You don't play any goddamn games. You have a nice, good, rational incentive race that doesn't exploit anybody and doesn't make anybody privileged. The end. So anyway, yeah, another huge, giant, preposterously big video. Yay!